First of all, what I'd like to ask you is about your relationship with him, but not just in the sense of how did you get to know him, and how did you meet, but also making a film about somebody like this. I think he's, as a free jazz artist. In jazz there's a lot of playing off of things, and kind of in the film there's a lot of this music is exceptionally present. I'm quite interested in how you maybe see the kind of creative relationship between the two of you in terms of you're making a film and incorporating his music, and how do those things play off each other?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And it was lovely to see the film in this theater. It feels quite grand up here, so. Yeah. Regarding our relationship, I was kind of compelled to wait outside his door after I saw him play a concert, after being a fan for many years, to ask him if he would take me on as a student. That was in 2004. So I'm a drummer and an electronic musician, and my time as Professor Graves' student and the time making the film are very much intertwined. And I think the film took different shapes at different times in that relationship. So, as it started, I was working at first as his assistant at Bennington College, teaching intro to percussion classes and working in his laboratory. And we would have private lessons at night, so there would be 3 or 4 classes during the day, and then we would work together in the studio from 10 p.m. to sometimes 2 a.m., 3 a.m., doing, playing together, learning martial arts, talking. And when I first met Milford, the way he talked about things was so dynamic, the way he connects things is so dynamic that I felt early on that I needed to record some of it. First in my mind was just to reflect on what he was talking about, so it was more like recording it on tape and playing it back in the car. But I also think that even at that point, I realized that I had access to someone who, I think if we have human civilization in 500 years, people are going to be looking at Milford Graves' music really closely, and that I felt compelled out of a sense of duty to help contribute to an archive. So for a couple of years, it felt like that. It felt like recording, adding to an archive that was growing, that was coming out of our time together. And then he started giving me archival footage that no one had ever seen. So I think the first time that happened was maybe 2006, 2007, and we watched the full reel of Super 8 of the School for Autism in Japan. It's about a 20-minute clip, and we watched it. So it was probably 100 degrees in the basement in New York City. We just projected it onto a wall, but I was so blown away by the cinematic quality of that footage, and not only that, but watching the room transform, the room of children transform, and also the one child who was kind of doing some self-soothing behaviors in the beginning of the film kind of was the person who approached the drum set and was dancing in front of the drum set, and kind of seeing Milford's eyes and that kid's eyes locked in. I kind of knew at that point there was a feature film somehow, and we talked about it and started kind of working that way, pulling things from the archive, arranging things. But the whole time, I think there was a interesting symbiotic relationship between the stuff I was learning from him as a musician, and then, now reflecting back, I realized I was kind of learning how to make a film that same way. So some of the core teachings that transformed me as a person and as an artist are the content of the film. So it really became about reflecting on what was most transformative to me as a student, and then not necessarily constructing the film to put myself in it, but to put the audience into a position where the film possibly has the potential to create some of that same transformative energy, rather than trying to construct something that told the story about the history of Milford Graves' work, but really about energy transfer and transformation.
I think that's kind of all the kind of connecting material, the shots of the a lot of natural stuff and colours. Like, I think it's beautiful how you use the camera much like an instrument, which obviously is connected to the fact that you're a musician too. I like what Milford said about trying to find more relevant vibrations, and just thinking about how light is a vibration as much as sound is. So I'm interested in finding more relevant vibrations in cinema. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think music was the way I knew how to make things previously, so I really thought about light as another instrument in the film, and the co-director Neil Young is also a drummer, and we edited together and really thought about the editing process as a drum duo. How do you make space for the light and make space for the sound, and there's time when the light takes a solo, and there's time when the sound takes a solo, and kind of thinking about it as composition that way, but not thinking that the sound vibrations and waves are supporting the light or vice versa, but they're kind of dancing together.
Beautiful. We can open up straight to the audience. I feel like everyone's very far away. There's one up in the top corner there.
Hi, thank you for a really great film. To be honest, I've never heard of Milford Graves, unfortunately, until today. But I'm really glad that I got to know at least a little bit about him. And I was wondering, kind of two-part question. First, how long did it take you to kind of collect the materials? So how long did it take you to shoot? How much actual footage did you have, and how did you, because he's such a complex person, how did you decide which kind of routes to take and what to include in the film and what to leave out?
It's a good question. I'll do my best to answer it. So as far as the time, I think the recordings of voice that make their way into the final cut of the film, the earliest ones were probably in 2004, so it's been about 15 years in the making. And as I was saying before, that took different shapes at different times. Sometimes I was making a short to help Milford with a lecture that he was doing somewhere, and that kind of grew and morphed into the garden scene, or I was digitizing photographs for him, and that turned into a different scene. But ultimately, I've been working in the dojo, in the garden, and in the basement for 15 years with Milford. So that's kind of, when I look back, I was pretty much started making the film not soon after I started as a student. And as far as what's in the film and what's not, so basically the way I think about that is there were different films that were growing, throughout the process, and different kind of, he is a really complex and dynamic person, and I always say there's thousands of films that could be made. The one that I made ultimately had to be about my own reflections on the teachings themselves and the Full Mantis, and kind of going straight to the source. And really how that worked was, once I had kind of had the experience with the footage from Japan and a couple other shots, started putting them together. The footage really, and I don't mean to sound too esoteric, but it was really a matter of watching and listening to the footage itself. And it kind of, on a good day, it kind of said what I wanted to do. And on days where I wasn't saying anything. I tried not to edit too much. So, you know, it was really a process of digging into the material and letting it in and listening to it. That kind of, the footage that made it up onto the screen was the footage that kept asking to be there on some level. So, you know, to the other part of your question, there's hundreds of hours of footage and interviews. Like I said, when I started, I was thinking about this as a contribution to an archive. So there's more archival, and I still work with the professor now. We're working on a project for the Queen's Museum right now that's going to have a lot of archival, and I think there's going to be other kinds of media that will find places in galleries or in other kinds of archives. So there's plenty more footage, and I'm still listening to that footage too, so see where it wants to go.
Another question? There we go.
Thank you for a really interesting film. Did you have any sense that, this might be a bit of a crazy question, but did you have any sense that if he'd spent most of his life in a quieter environment, that his music would have been slower and quieter? Because you seem to have, in the film, there seems to be a direct parallel, especially at the start and at the very end, between the noise of the traffic in the background all the time and like this crazy fast rhythm, kind of loud sort of style.
Well, I don't know. I think the environment is intrinsically linked to who he is, and who he is intrinsically linked to the music that's come through him. But I think of Milford's music more. It can relate to traffic, I guess, in the same way that it can relate to biology. And Milford will talk about, when people say he plays fast, to talk about, you know, astrological time, and that it would maybe be really slow if you thought of it from a different perspective. It's into the theory of relativity. So I think the environment is important, and I did feel compelled to share it. But I think what's really kind of fascinating about what Milford's done with, you know, his life and his environment is when you do open. So South Jamaica, Queens is right under the JFK airport in New York City. It's an outer borough. It's the last stop on the J on the subway, and it's very urban, busy. It's where the New York City subway ends and the railroad connects. So there's a lot of train activity, there's a lot of traffic. But if you walk around that neighborhood at night, there's an ecosystem of insects that only live in that little garden. And I think the garden is a character in the film, and a character, but it exists with the street and the subway connected to it. He didn't really need to move to the countryside to make that happen. And I think, like a lot of things in his life, the garden is a source of inspiration. It's also a place for creativity and playfulness and art, and it also is something that nourishes him. I think you can look at the martial arts that way too. It's functional self-defense, it's creative. And you know, the symbol, there's shows where I've seen the symbol be a symbol and then it turns into a hat, you know, and that's really, I think, a big lesson that comes from working with Milford, is that you can take a 12 by 16 square and turn it into an environment for reflection, relaxation, and creativity, not unlike being in nature. But I did really like the idea of like looking at a flower and hearing the subway cinematically. I think that's like one of the great things you can do with cinema, which is, you know, use sound to put you in place. And I like the idea of going closer and closer and closer to insects and hearing closer and closer and closer what's behind you, behind the fence at the same time. I thought that was an an interesting thing. And it does feel like that a little bit in the garden, sometimes jarred by the sounds that are right behind you, and then you get back into a kind of biophilia state of mind.
There is another question up in the top corner.
I was really glad that you did resist the temptation to tell a normal biographical story, traditionally, and where he was born or where he came from. But I'm just wondering whether, and I could probably go away and find out, but where this came from for him, where does this life force that's in him come from? Do you know that? Is there something in his early life, or someone who taught him, perhaps, as he's been your sort of master, as it were?
I don't know if I can speak to that, but I can say my own perspective is that he's a really special person, and I wanted to include some context, but the life force that's in Milford, and when you come in contact with him, is very special. So I don't think he's someone who had a lot of teachers. He's really self-taught. He's one of the few. He's a professor emeritus at Bennington College, but he didn't go to college himself. And I think he's always been someone who has a voracious appetite for learning. One story that's not in the film that I can share is that at the Queen's Library in Jamaica, he was known as a kid to go there with a shopping cart to take out books when there was no limit on the limit of library books you could take out. And so he's someone who is always hungry for learning. And interestingly, a lot of those kinds of forms that you see in movies about artists, like, it's impossible to talk to Milford usually about something in his past, because he wants to show you what he's working on that day in the garden or in the basement. So he's not someone that you visit and he's really not interested in talking about his first record or when he played with Howard Eiler. He wants to show you how he's wired up the anatomical structure to the heartbeat, and it's going through the drum. And I wanted to try to deliver that part of who he was, because that's really the part that I experienced. So yeah, as far as the divine life force, I mean, yeah.
Is there another question? Right down here in front.
Hey, brilliant film. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. So thank you so much.
I wanted to ask if you, thank you, I just said it was brilliant and thank you so much. I wanted to know what kind of relationship he has with his wife and his children.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and one that I had to think about a lot in making the film. They have a great relationship. Mrs. Graves is an amazing person, but someone who kind of opted to not be in the film. Super supportive at the house. She's been to all the screenings in New York City, and she is kind of shy on camera, and also said that she didn't really want to be filmed. So there were times, I was there so much I had footage, and there were kind of cuts that made sense, but I ultimately, in this film, it was really about Milford's voice, and without her really wanting to be in it, there wasn't really, it wasn't something I could pursue. But I can tell you that they've been together since high school. They're still married, very supportive of one another, cook together every night. The children and the grandchildren, when we premiered in New York City at Lincoln Center, they took up a whole 2 rows and all stood up and were celebrated by the audience. And Milford talked about wanting his family to be at Lincoln Center and all this great stuff. So the family's super sweet, and they're all kind of part of this. And so Mrs. Graves shows up in some of the footage from the 80s when they're planting together. And that's kind of about it, but in the film it's kind of unresolved, because it wouldn't have felt right to kind of put more footage of her in there without really developing her as a character in the film and a relationship, and it didn't really seem like an option. But yeah, it's a great person, and in some of the early rough cuts, she was really supportive of where the film was going. She's a good friend.
We've been asked to wrap up, so I'm just going to say thank you very much. I know you said that you made the film as an archival endeavor, but I think it has an enormous amount of value in the present now as well. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks for having me.